The war had entered into us like wine. We had set out in a rain of flowers to seek the death of heroes. The war was our dream of greatness, power, and glory. It was a man's work, a duel on fields whose flowers would be stained with blood. There is no lovelier death in the world. Anything rather than stay at home. Anything to make one with the rest. Ernst Jünger's account of World War I is incredibly brutal and a hyper-realistic description of trench warfare and the combat that took place during probably one of the most terrible moments in human history. He was present during the Somme offensive. He was wounded 14 times in battle. He even almost received a gunshot wound to the head. In fact, it entered through his helmet and just grazed the tip of his skull before exiting out the other end of his helmet. He came close to death again and again, being blown back by artillery shells, watching his friends blown up right next to him or cut down by machine gun fire. He would enter into trenches, hurling grenades and firing right in the face of his enemies. When we discuss Jünger, it's important to look at his background a little bit. He was notably a pretty rowdy, adventurous, and troublesome young man. He joined the Wunderwall movement early in his life, and this was basically a different assortment of groups of young men who wanted to be out in nature and rejected industrialization and rejected modernity. They wanted to be out and one with the mountains and the quiet sereneness of the environment. Shortly before the onset of World War I, Jünger actually ran away from home and joined the French Foreign Legion, which was actually illegal because he joined so close to World War I. At the outbreak of World War I, his father had to request special permission for Jünger to return to Germany and enlist in the military. He was a troublesome young man, and it's quite interesting because it seems that he found his calling and he found his place in the world through warfare, through some of the most brutal combat, through some of the most horrendous situations is where he found himself complete almost. When we talk about A Storm of Steel, it's often compared to All Quiet on the Western Front. Some notable differences right off the bat are that All Quiet on the Western Front is a work of fiction. The writer of All Quiet on the Western Front, Eric Marie Remarque, I think that's how you say his name, was notably anti-war. And when he wrote All Quiet on the Western Front, it was heavily influenced by the roughly 1 year he spent fighting during World War I. With All Quiet on the Western Front clearly being an anti-war book, Storm of Steel is much more ambiguous. The differences between the two writers are that Jünger fought the entirety of World War I, and when he writes, he doesn't paint a picture that necessarily is pro or anti-war. It's very brutal, it's very realistic. It talks about the emotions of the soldiers, both of great courage and even of great fear. It talks about the heroism and the bravery and the courage that his comrades displayed in battle, shouting out orders, walking upright through gunfire, being shot down in a hail of bullets. He writes no holds barred. He writes as if war is this sort of transcendental and existential experience. And he sees himself as improved almost from his experience at war. He considers himself lucky to have gone through all these horrible experiences, but somehow survived. And like I said, he was wounded 14 times. He was injured quite grievously during the end of the war. He won the award, which is known as the Pour le Mérite, which was one of the highest military orders that you could be rewarded in the German military. And he was rewarded that after charging a British line and being injured again and again and surrounded by so many British soldiers and having to fight his way out with his comrades until he was actually able to fight his way out with countless wounds, bleeding, with bullets inside of him. And he made it out and back to friendly lines instead of surrendering. He was prepared to die rather than surrender to his enemy. And this is the kind of man we're dealing with in Ernst Jünger. This is the kind of tenacity and vigor that this man had. And like I said, he fought during the Somme offensive, which was one of the worst battles in human history. Just countless wave after wave of British soldiers charging against the German lines, being cut down by machine gun fire and close-quartered trench warfare, bayonets stabbing into this man and that, grenades thrown, like I said, rifles fired at point blank range. And there's just so much destruction and brutality. But like I said, Jünger never fails to honor the courage of his comrades and even his enemies. Despite the brutality of the war, Jünger never felt ill will towards his enemies. He never felt ill will towards the French or the English or the many other allied forces that he fought against. He saw them simply as combatants, and combatants to be honored even. And it was his duty to kill them. And he never for one second hesitated to kill them. But he never hated them either. He always respected the fact that they were in pretty much the same position of him on the other side of the field. And he starts off the war as an enlisted soldier, but enrolls himself into an officer's course in which he becomes an ensign, a lieutenant, and eventually even an acting captain. And you see this development over time throughout the war, where he goes from a sort of uncertain man to a confident leader. He talks about the fear he feels, but he stoically sort of displays that, or describes that he can't show his fear in front of his comrades. If he wants to be a good leader, he can't show any fear. And like I said, there's just so much destruction and brutality in this book. He talks about a young girl sitting in a pool of blood. He walks by French corpses, like literally months into decay, just their skulls remaining and their uniforms still attached to their bodies. But he also talks about the beautiful moments that he experienced in the little moments in between fighting. He talks about how the birds are unbothered by the war. The birds, they continue singing. You know, you might have a barrage of artillery and rifle fire, but when it stops, the birds are still singing. He also talks about the interaction he has with the civilians. Many of these interactions were with Belgian people and French people. He talks about a young woman lives on her own in a little cottage, and it's sort of implied, I think, that they had a little romantic affair, and he would go over during his free time and eat dinner with her. And he talks about seeing, you know, beautiful young women in the sort of more peaceful areas, like away from the front, going off on train rides. And he talks about the little pleasure he sees, or he feels, when he sees these little moments, these little peaceful moments, these beautiful things. He makes friends, like I said, with the civilians. He talks about having dinner with some of the locals and how they treat him well, and how they feed him and they have good conversation with him. And, you know, he also obviously talks about all his friends and comrades that he served alongside. He talks like about their heroism and their courage and how they died with honor. It's definitely a very, very brutal but very beautiful description of war. And he writes with such beautiful language, like you saw in the beginning of the book that I read out to you. And I also want to read a few of the other quotes that I really felt were profound. And he says, "What is more sublime than to face death at the head of 100 men? Such a one will never find obedience fail him, for courage runs through the ranks like wine." Like, he writes just so vividly and so beautifully about these terrible things. He finds the beauty in the heroism and in the courage of the fighting men, despite how brutal it is. He finds beauty in how men are able to pass time in trenches full of water, being blown to bits by artillery fire, filled with a bunch of smelly, sleepless men, right? He talks about the sleepless nights, like how he's always has to be working. He always has to be working on something, whether it's digging trenches, emptying the water out of the trenches, or fixing his equipment or whatever. He barely gets any sleep when he's on the fronts. It's really terrible conditions, but he finds beauty in all these little moments regardless. And I think what really sticks out to me about The Storm of Steel is finding the endurance to make it through these hard times, because ultimately terrible things can happen in our lives. You never know when the next great war could happen, and we're thrust into these moments where death is all around us, where there literally could be a 10% chance of survival. And I think it's interesting when it comes to fear. I think a lot of fear comes down to the feelings of uncertainty. And I think if we can come to terms with the worst possible outcome, let's say death in this case, if you can come to terms with that, then you won't feel fear. I think that's what Jünger did. I think he sort of rationalized the fact that he might die, but that he had to go and do what he needed to do anyway. This was his duty, that he had to go forward no matter what, even if it meant risking death. And I think that we can find inspiration from that courage. And we could also find inspiration in the authenticity of how he describes the war. It's not a pro-war book. It's not anti-war by any means, but it's not pro-war. It doesn't glorify war. It talks about the good and the bad, the beautiful and the ugly. It's a very three-dimensional description of it. I think that's something that writers in general should strive towards reaching that three-dimensional depth. Especially nowadays, our views towards war are very one-sided. Just avoid war at all costs. We should only fight defensive wars, all these different things. But a lot of times, wars that we are told are defensive really aren't. And there's all these different convoluted motivations for war, and all these different reasons that we say we're at war, when in reality it could be something not so pretty. And sometimes we might be called to fight in wars that aren't justified. You take the Vietnam War, for example. You might be called to do that, and you have to do your duty, even if you don't believe in the war, even if you don't believe what you're doing is right. But you, as a member of a collective group, in this case, maybe the United States, you have to do your duty, and that's sort of what we're born into. There's some things you just can't avoid, and you have to be ready no matter what for them, right? And I think there's just all these different interesting things that you kind of have to think of, and thoughts that you might get out of this book. So I highly recommend it. It's a wonderful book. It's very much a work of prose, like very prosy, in the sense that there's all this vibrant language, but there's not really a direction the book goes. Like, it starts off with his experiences at the beginning all the way to the end of the war, but there's really no point to the book. It's just a raw account of warfare. It's kind of like if you've ever seen Black Hawk Down. There's a beginning and an end, but there's no like real climax to Black Hawk Down. There's no real like traditional arc to the movie. It's just an account of the war. There's no message. There's no anti-war, pro-war message in Black Hawk Down. It's just a movie about a military engagement and how it went wrong, and the courage of the men fighting, and just an account of it. And I think that's kind of what Storm of Steel ends up being. But it's a wonderful book. I highly recommend you read it. Ernst Jünger is one of the most interesting figures, I think, in the 20th century. He was in many ways nationalistic, but also I think his philosophy goes beyond nationalism. It's so much more complex than just calling him a nationalist. If you read his works like Der Arbeiter, which is The Worker, or On Pain, you really get a better grasp of what his philosophy really was about. And I think it sort of takes influence from Nietzsche and applies it to a developing world, to a technologically advancing world. You see this a lot in On Pain and The Worker. If you ever read his book On the Marble Cliffs, it's an allegory to all sorts of totalitarianist governments. However, it is written specifically influenced by his life in Nazi Germany, and it's a very good book. I also recommend On the Marble Cliffs. It's a very beautifully written book. There's just a lot to be learned from Jünger and his philosophy, and I highly recommend that you pick up a copy of one of his books. Definitely start off with Storm of Steel. It's a very interesting read, and I think you'll learn a lot from it. I know I certainly learned a lot from it. But anyway, this was just a quick video. I know I have a lot of long form content, and I thought maybe I'd try to compress this and just kind of get the main important points down. But as always, this is the Warrior Philosopher, building the foundations of the warrior philosophy. We'll see you next time.